So it's the morning after the night before, and Donald Trump has been declared the winner of the 2016 US election. Joining me is Jeremy Shapiro, ECFR's research director, also a former colleague of Hillary Clinton's at the State Department in the US. And he's going to give us a brief rundown of some talking points following this enormous, monumental result. Jeremy, first of all, a personal reaction from you as an American and as an internationalist American, as a liberal and as a former colleague of Clinton's.
Yeah, it's personally devastating to me. I mean, it's not really news to me that I am somewhat out of touch with popular feeling in my country, but this still is quite something from my perspective, because even though I have always understood that there is a great deal of anger against the establishment, it's still impossible for me as an individual to understand how people could vote. Even people who felt that way could vote for Donald Trump, who seems to me to be so self-evidently fraudulent and racist, and it's very troubling to realize just how out of touch I am with the majority of the country.
I mean, on that, you're not necessarily that out of touch, because people did acknowledge this, and the opinion polling showed this. People believed that he was unqualified. They believed that his temperament was unsuited to the presidency, and they still.
But they voted for him anyway, and that, to me, that is not an attitude that I can understand. One of the most interesting interviews I saw with a Trump supporter was when they asked her, "Are you afraid of his temperament?" He said, "Yeah, there's a good chance that he will kill us all, but I think we need to shake things up. We need to change." And that's just not an attitude I can get behind. That's just not an attitude I understand, and frankly, that's not an attitude which makes any sense to me.
Agreed. Talking about shock and surprise at the result, you're not, of course, the only one who was shocked. Everybody who was involved in predicting this election, from the commentators to the pollsters to the bookies, has been surprised by this results. Can you reflect somewhat on how badly the establishment as a whole got it wrong and how the polling industry got it wrong?
It's very interesting. I mean, I think we're going to have to do a very serious postmortem of this from a polling standpoint. This is, I think, from a U.S. presidential election standpoint, the biggest miss in the polls that we've probably had since 1948, possibly including 1948. It's not even principally that Clinton was ahead about 4 points in the national polls going into the night, but also that she was ahead by even more in some of the key states like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin that she ended up losing. So there were polling errors on the order of 7 and 8 points in some states, and you don't generally see that, especially across the board. And I think it's going to call into discredit the entire enterprise of presidential polling unless we can actually get to the bottom of why that happened and understand it. I think it means that in the next presidential election, nobody's going to believe whatever these things say.
And people have drawn comparisons with Brexit here, that the pollsters got it wrong on Brexit and they got it wrong here. But this is different, isn't it? Can you explain how it's different?
Not. Yeah, no, it's not right. That's not right. In Brexit, the pollsters were roughly speaking correct. They entered into the evening by saying that it's basically a toss-up, slight edge to Remain, but they really were saying we don't know how it will come out, and so they were within their margin of error on the Brexit vote. But this was in specific states. This was very, very different than that.
All right. Well, moving on from the result, let's think about President Donald Trump. We're going to have to get used to.
Do we have
saying
to?
That. Unfortunately, we do. Obviously, we're speaking from the European Council on Foreign Relations, so our primary is what Donald Trump is going to be like from an international perspective, from a foreign policy perspective. Can you give us some idea of what to expect in terms of his commitment to Europe and to international institutions, that kind of thing?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's clear that from the campaign trail that Donald Trump's foreign policy is not very well articulated. He's loathed specifics, and he's embraced contradiction throughout the campaign. And so it's a little bit hard to narrow down exactly what his foreign policy approach is. But I think I would focus on three things which have been, I think, core beliefs that he has taken through his entire active political life, which stretches back to the 1980s. And I think you see a certain consistency in these three core things. The first is that he thinks that the United States gets a raw deal from its allies and from the global order, and he wants to change that deal. The second is he really doesn't like the global trade regime, and he thinks particularly that multilateral trade deals are always a bad deal for the United States, and that they put globalism ahead of America, and that it's important to put America before the global interest. And third is that he has a great deal of admiration and respect for strong men, usually authoritarian strong men, and you can see that he seems to believe that he has, as another strong man, he has the capacity to reach out with them and I guess make strong man deals together. I think those three, I guess, principles more than policies will inform how he conducts foreign policy. And I think for Europe, which has an alliance with the United States, which is based not on a transactional model, but on a model of solidarity and on a shared system of values of democracy, I think it means that Trump isn't really going to be very interested in that. It's not that he won't necessarily relate to Europe or that he won't cooperate with Europe, but he's not going to do it on the typical basis of solidarity and shared history and shared values.
And how is that foreign policy perspective or actual policy is going to be affected by the other elections that were happening yesterday, the elections in the Senate and the Congress, etc.?
Yeah, so with Trump taking the presidency and the Republicans holding both houses of the Congress, we have pretty much one-party control of the United States to a degree which is unprecedented for many decades. The Republicans not only control the presidency, the Senate, and the House, but they will also control the Supreme Court. And they will control about 2/3 of the state legislatures and the governorships. So they'll basically be in pretty firm control throughout almost every level of American governance. I think this means that a lot of Europeans have been looking at Trump and sort of saying, well, he's not my cup of tea, but the American system of checks and balances will limit him, and he won't actually be able to implement the crazier things he's talking about, like eliminating climate change or the Paris Climate Change Treaty, or the Iran deal, or gutting the WTO, or essentially paying no attention to the U.S.'s UN obligations and law of war obligations. But I would submit that this single-party control, in combination with the increased powers of the U.S. presidency over the last couple of decades, means that in fact Trump will have quite a bit of freedom to implement this stuff, particularly in the foreign policy realm.
Speaking of some of the crazier things he said on the campaign trail, we saw a different Donald Trump this morning in his speech. He was somewhat magnanimous. He praised Secretary Clinton, and he talked about bringing the country together and being a president for all Americans. Do you think that we can expect a radically different President Trump to what we saw on the campaign trail?
I don't think so. I mean, I agree with your point that this was a distinct kind of speech for him. I would point out, however, it was a very normal victory speech. It was precisely the victory speech that you expect everybody to give. So essentially what we're saying is Donald Trump, for once, does the normal thing, and how weird is that? And I'm not willing to extrapolate from I think the speech was fine. I think it showed a magnanimity, it showed grace, exactly as you'd want a victor to do. But I'm not willing to extrapolate from that one instance and ignore the last 18 months and really 20 years of Trump's behavior and assume somehow that winning the presidency is going to make him less of an egomaniac. I know it wouldn't have that effect on me. I think it would have quite the opposite effect.
All right. Well, to bring it back to us for the final question, how should Europe address this Donald Trump? How should they approach him, and how should they respond to him?
So I think that the European impulse will be to assume that they can reach out early, that they can appeal to Donald Trump on the basis of shared history and shared values, and that they can shape his thinking. I think this will be the conceit. And so I think you'll see early and often efforts by European officials from all of the big countries and most of the small ones to go and try to get in touch with Trump advisors and to talk to Trump, and even to send maybe even a high-level delegation to talk to Trump himself. I think that this is a real mistake. We don't really know a lot about what Trump wants from Europe, But we do know that we do know how he negotiates. I mean, he is, as he so frequently likes to say, the author of The Art of the Deal. He didn't apparently write the book, but he does talk about it a lot, so I guess we can assume it reflects his thought. And what that book says, among other things, is that the person who opens the negotiation and lays their cards on the table first is creating a position of weakness for themselves. And I think that's precisely how Trump will see that European outreach.
So instead, Europe should do...
My recommendation would be to create leverage, and create leverage by seizing hostages in diplomatic terms, which means doing things that that Trump specifically will not like, that the United States government will not like, in order that you can give them up in subsequent negotiations.
All right, well, thanks very much for your initial reactions, Jeremy. We will be doing, obviously, continued analysis on the fallout, if we can call it that, from this election victory over the coming days. So do check in with us on Twitter at ECFR and online at www.ecfr.eu. Thank you.